Welcome to another episode of History Plots, brought to you by the Waukegan History Museum, which is jointly operated by the Waukegan Park District and the Waukegan Historical Society. On this episode, we celebrate Veterans Day and visit the burials of just a few of the many veterans buried at Waukegan's Oakwood Cemetery. In this episode, we are focusing on veterans who fought in wars in the 19th century. In episode 1 of History Plots, we told the stories of some of our early settlers who had been born in the 1700s. We do have some settlers buried in Oakwood who were alive during the Revolutionary War. However, we have not uncovered any who fought in that war. We do have veterans of the War of 1812. Paris Barney was born in Vermont on May 3rd, 1799. So when the War of 1812 started, Paris Barney was 13 years old. And Paris served as a substitute for Solomon Curtis. He was a private in Captain Oliver Scott's company of the New York military. He was enlisted and discharged twice, both times for less than 1 month. He came to Lake County in the 1850s. But before this, Paris Barney filed for a land claim bounty for serving in the War of 1812 because he was a substitute. The man, though, whom he subbed for was deceased and could not give a witness to Barney. A friend of Barney sent an affidavit that Curtis was deceased and left no wife or children. Finally, Paris Barney was granted the land request. When Paris Barney died, his wife filed for a widow's pension. She was denied at first, but after a legal battle, finally was given his pension. Dr. Charles Aime was born in France on July 10, 1815. His father was a cavalry officer and a close friend of the author Victor Hugo. The family, though, was banished from France by Napoleon, and they went to England. Charles attended college in England, and then, when the family could return to France, he completed his education at the cavalry school, graduating with the rank of lieutenant. He was then invited to teach cavalry tactics in the United States and Pennsylvania, arriving there in 1837. During this time, he took up the study of medicine. In the 1840s, Charles Aime was given the rank of colonel and served during the Indian troubles in Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. He later also served in the early Mexican Wars from 1846 to 1848. Charles married twice. The first marriage had 3 children, the second having 9. Dr. Charles Aime died in 1901. He is buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Waukegan along with his second wife and some of their children. Herbert and Percy Aime both served in the Spanish-American War. For young Percy, though, he came down with typhoid in Cuba. Percy was brought back to the hospital in Long Island, New York, where he died from the disease. He was 20 years old. Herbert would go on to also serve in the United States military in World War I. Ben Jones was born in Waukegan in 1879. On the morning of June 22, 1898, Ben was mowing the front lawn of his father's home. He read a call for volunteers, apparently stopped his mowing, went down to Chicago, and joined Company I of the 1st Illinois Volunteers. Ben was sent to Cuba to be in the Spanish-American War. He was first on the firing line, but then was detailed to camp duty. Ben was sent with 175 other soldiers to build a yellow fever camp at Siboney, Cuba. In a short time, though, he was stricken with yellow fever. Ben survived the ravages of yellow fever, but he then came down with typhoid. Very ill, Ben was brought back to Long Island, New York. There, he died in the hospital on September 3, 1898. His body was brought back to Waukegan and buried with military honors. Ben Jones was 19 years old. The Civil War was the first war for which Waukegan citizens participated. Following the war, the Grand Army of the Republic, Post 374, was established. and the GAR Post purchased plots in Oakwood for any veterans of the Civil War. In total, 231 Civil War veterans are buried in Oakwood Cemetery. One of the 470 men from Waukegan to participate in the Civil War was Michael Devlin. Devlin was born in Ireland in 1837. He immigrated to the United States in the 1850s and settled in Waukegan with the profession of farming. At the age of 23, Devlin decided to fight for the Union, and he volunteered with many other local boys in the 96th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. With the 96th, Devlin fought in many battles, including those at Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain, and Missionary Ridge. On June 18, 1864, Devlin and others from the 96th were captured at Kennesaw Mountain. Devlin, now a prisoner of war for the Confederate Army, is sent to the now infamous Andersonville prison. Later, Devlin was moved to the Florence Stockade, another of the notorious Confederate prisons. With the Union lines approaching the Florence Stockade, many Confederate guards fled the prison. This allowed Devlin to escape to the Union lines in February of 1865. Devlin is back home in Waukegan a couple of months later when news comes of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrendering. This news sparks celebrations in the North as the news of Lee's surrender signals the beginning of the end of the Civil War. The citizens of Waukegan give the honor of firing the ceremonial shots for the end of the war on the old cannon on the grounds of the Lake County Courthouse to Michael Devlin. Devlin, who had survived so many battles along with 2 prisoner of war camps, receives his most severe injury firing the old cannon in Waukegan. The cannon misfires, knocking Devlin out. When Devlin comes to, he has major hearing loss, but ultimately it improves and he makes a full recovery. Michael Devlin died in 1909 and is buried in Waukegan's Oakwood Cemetery. A favorite person that we love to share and tell stories about at Oakwood Cemetery is George Washington Bell. Bell, who is African American, was born into slavery on a plantation near Nashville, Tennessee around 1816. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Bell was in charge of his master's distillery. Once the war started, though, Bell's master put him to work for the Confederacy, carrying food and supplies. Bell, who was a great storyteller, loved to talk about the time when he was surprised and captured by Union soldiers on one of these trips carrying supplies. Bell was promised no harm if he would enlist in the Union Army, and that's what he did. Bell was assigned to the 40th Tennessee Cavalry, and he started out as a cook. He loved to share that he had the honor of cooking for President Lincoln while he was on a battlefield visit. The most famous story, though, that Bell told was the time when he heard that a train near his old plantation was being loaded up with slaves to be taken down south to keep them from being liberated. Bell, knowing some of these slaves and very concerned that he would never see them again, grabbed a pistol and a musket. He mounted a horse and told other soldiers that he was going to stop the train. Bell made it through the Confederate picket lines. He boarded the train just before it was to leave, and at gunpoint, Bell ordered the conductor to stop the train. The conductor refused, so Bell shot him dead on the spot. Other Confederate soldiers, hearing the gunshot, tried to board the engine, but Bell was able to hold them off long enough until some of the other soldiers from his regiment arrived. The train was stopped, and the slaves on board were free. It turned out that Bell was most concerned about one of the slaves on the train, her name, Emily Babbs. Shortly after this event, George and Emily were married in Nashville. Following the war, George and Emily Bell moved to Waukegan in the 1880s. George Washington Bell takes on the profession of brick mason in Waukegan. Bell died at the age of 94, on December 6, 1910. In his obituary, he was remembered fondly for his many stories that he loved to share. George and Emily are buried next to each other in Waukegan's Oakwood Cemetery. Thank you for joining us for another episode of History Plots, this one where we celebrate Veterans Day and look at just a few of the burials of various veterans throughout beautiful Oakwood Cemetery in Waukegan, Illinois. History Plots was brought to you by the Waukegan History Museum, which is jointly operated by the Waukegan Park District and the Waukegan Historical Society.